The year is 1933, and the United States of America is dying. Imagine yourself standing on a train platform. The year is 1933. You board a locomotive heading from New York to Washington, D.C. As you settle into your seat and watch the American landscape roll past your window, what you see is not the land of opportunity. What you see looks like the end of the world itself. If you looked out the window of that train traveling through the industrial heartland, you would see a landscape that resembled nothing less than an apocalypse. The great factories that had once been the beating heart of American prosperity stood silent, their smokestacks cold and lifeless against the perpetually gray sky. These massive industrial cathedrals, which just a few years earlier had roared with the sound of American manufacturing might, now sat as hollow monuments to a prosperity that had vanished almost overnight. The fields that should have been green with crops were fallow and brown, the soil turning to dust. Farmers had given up. There was no market for their goods. There was no point in planting when you couldn't sell the harvest. In the cities, the collapse of normal society was even more visible and even more heartbreaking. Men in expensive suits, men who had once been stockbrokers, lawyers, accountants, managers, stood on street corners selling apples for pennies, just to scrape together enough money to buy a single piece of bread to feed their families. These were men who had believed in the American dream, who had climbed the ladder of success, and who had lost everything when the financial system collapsed. Their eyes were hollow, their hands shook as they held out their wares to passers-by who had no money to spare. In the public parks of every major city, entire villages made of cardboard, scrap metal, and shattered dreams had sprung up like poisonous mushrooms. These ramshackle settlements were called Hoovervilles, named with bitter irony after President Herbert Hoover, the man who had presided over the catastrophic collapse of the American economy, and who seemed powerless or unwilling to stop the suffering. In these makeshift communities, families huddled around burning trash cans for warmth. Children with distended bellies from malnutrition played in the mud. Men who had once owned homes, who had once provided for their families with dignity, now waited in lines that stretched for blocks just to receive a bowl of watery soup from a charity kitchen. The Great Depression was not just a recession. It was not just an economic downturn. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. 1 in 4 American men, 25% of the entire male workforce, was out of work. And these statistics, grim as they were, didn't capture the full horror of what was happening. People were literally starving to death in the richest country on earth. Malnutrition-related diseases that had been virtually eliminated in America were returning. Families were being torn apart. Suicide rates were soaring. The social fabric that held the nation together was being shredded thread by thread. There was a feeling in the air, a palpable sense of dread that hung over the country like a toxic fog. It was the feeling that the American experiment had failed. The great promise of democracy and capitalism, that anyone could make it if they worked hard enough, seemed like a cruel joke. Democracy itself seemed weak, impotent, unable to address the suffering of its people. Capitalism seemed fundamentally broken, a system designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. In the coffee shops, in the union halls, in the speakeasies, and the breadlines, people whispered about revolution. These weren't idle fantasies. These were serious conversations about tearing down the entire system and starting over. Some looked to Russia and the rising tide of communism and thought that maybe, just maybe, the workers should seize the factories and redistribute the wealth. The Soviet Union, after all, claimed it had no unemployment, no poverty. The propaganda posters showed happy workers building a new world. To desperate Americans, it looked appealing. Others looked to Europe, where a new kind of strongman was rising from the chaos. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had seized power and promised to restore order and national greatness. He had made the trains run on time, people said. He had given Italy back its pride. The corporate state, where business and government merged into a single powerful machine, seemed to work. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler had just been appointed chancellor in January of 1933, promising to restore national pride, to put Germans back to work, to make Germany great again. The economic miracle he promised was seductive to people around the world who were suffering. Fear was the only currency that had any value left. Fear of starvation. Fear of revolution. Fear of the future itself. And nowhere was the fear greater than on Wall Street, in the marble halls of the great banks and in the boardrooms of the industrial giants. The bankers, the industrialists, and the tycoons who actually ran the country were absolutely terrified. They watched the breadlines growing longer. They saw the anger building in the eyes of the unemployed. They read the reports of labor unrest and violent strikes. And they saw their own doom approaching. They genuinely believed that the mob was coming for them, that the American people would rise up in fury and drag them from their mansions. They believed that the guillotine was being sharpened, and that the French Revolution was about to replay itself on American soil. Their nightmares were filled with visions of their own heads rolling into baskets. And then, in March of 1933, a new president walked onto the stage of American history. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. To the poor, to the hungry, to the desperate masses of unemployed workers, Roosevelt was nothing less than a savior sent from heaven. In his inaugural address, delivered on March 4th, 1933, he spoke the words that would define his presidency. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He promised a new deal for the American people. He promised to use the full power of the federal government to feed the hungry and employ the jobless. He promised bold, persistent experimentation. He promised hope. But to the rich, to the banking elite, to the captains of industry who had built their fortunes on the old system, Roosevelt was something far more sinister. He was a traitor to his class. Franklin Roosevelt came from an old, wealthy, aristocratic family. The Roosevelts were American royalty. He had attended the finest schools, Groton and Harvard. He should have been one of them, defending their interests, protecting their wealth. Instead, he had turned against his own kind like a viper in their midst. When Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard in April of 1933, effectively devaluing the dollar to help farmers and debtors pay off their loans, he cost the banks millions upon millions of dollars. Bonds that they held lost half their value overnight. The bankers felt they had been robbed by their own government. When Roosevelt started talking about Social Security, about minimum wage laws, about banking regulations, about taxing the wealthy to pay for public works programs, the tycoons saw it as nothing less than the end of American freedom as they understood it. To them, freedom meant the freedom to do business without government interference. Roosevelt's New Deal looked like communism in disguise. They called him a socialist. They called him a communist. They called him a dictator. The irony of wealthy Americans calling for a strong man to replace Roosevelt because they thought Roosevelt was a dictator was apparently lost on them. And in the smoke-filled private clubs of New York City, in the exclusive dining rooms where only the wealthiest men in America could enter in the boardrooms of the great banks, where the real power resided, a whisper began to circulate like a virus, a whisper that grew louder with each passing day, a whisper that perhaps Roosevelt needed to be stopped. Not by an election. They had already lost that battle. The people loved Roosevelt. But by force. By a coup d'etat, by installing a government that would protect their interests. This is the story of the most dangerous moment in American history. It is a story that has been deliberately erased from the textbooks, buried under decades of historical amnesia and willful forgetting. It is the story of how the richest men in America, men whose names you would recognize, men whose companies still exist today, plotted to overthrow the government of the United States and install a fascist dictator in the White House. They had the money. They had access to weapons. They had a detailed plan. They were serious. This was not fantasy. This was treason. But they made one fatal mistake that would unravel the entire conspiracy. They tried to hire the wrong man. To understand why the plot failed, why democracy survived this existential threat, we first have to understand the man they tried to recruit. We have to understand what made him different. His name was Smedley Darlington Butler. In 1933, Smedley Butler was not just a soldier. He was not just a general. He was a living legend. He was the most decorated Marine in the history of the United States Marine Corps. He was one of only 19 men in American history to ever receive the Medal of Honor, and he had received it twice. Twice, he had performed acts of such extraordinary heroism under fire that the nation had pinned its highest military decoration on his chest. Butler was born a Quaker from Pennsylvania, which was itself a profound contradiction. The Quakers are pacifists, people of peace who refuse violence under any circumstances. And yet from this tradition of nonviolence came one of the greatest warriors America has ever produced. It was a contradiction that would define his entire life and ultimately save the Republic. He had lied about his age to join the Marines at just 16 years old. He was a boy who wanted to prove himself, who wanted to be a man, who wanted to serve his country. And serve, he did. He had fought in the Philippines during the brutal war to suppress the Filipino independence movement. He had fought in China during the Boxer Rebellion, where at the age of 18 he carried a wounded comrade for miles through enemy territory, while he himself had been shot in the leg, blood pouring from the wound with each agonizing step. He had fought in the banana wars of Central America, leading Marines through jungles and swamps in Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. He had commanded troops in the trenches of France during the First World War, experiencing the mechanized slaughter of modern industrial warfare. The troops under his command loved him with an intensity that bordered on worship. They called him Old Gimlet Eye because of his piercing stare, the look of a man who had seen death and wasn't impressed. He was a soldier's soldier, a leader who embodied everything that military men claimed to value. He didn't lead from the back, safe in some headquarters miles from the fighting. He lived in the mud with his men. He slept in the trenches. He ate the same terrible food. He shared their dangers and their hardships. When his men died, he wept. He was charismatic, profane, absolutely fearless in battle, and utterly devoted to the welfare of the soldiers under his command. But by 1933, something profound had changed inside Smedley Butler. He had spent 33 years, his entire adult life, serving the flag, following orders, doing his duty. But when he retired and finally had time to reflect, when he looked back on his career with clear eyes unclouded by the fog of war and propaganda, he didn't see glory. He didn't see heroism. He saw a racket. He saw a con game. He saw himself as an enforcer for corporate interests. He realized with a bitter clarity that in almost every conflict he had fought, in almost every war and intervention and military action, the United States military had not been fighting for freedom or democracy or American values. It had been fighting for money, for corporate profits, for the financial interests of wealthy men who never risked their own lives. He had invaded Haiti not to bring democracy, but to protect the profits of the National City Bank, which had made loans to the Haitian government and wanted its money back. He had invaded Nicaragua not to fight communism, but to protect the Brown Brothers brokerage house. He had invaded Honduras not to stop tyranny, but to protect the United Fruit Company's banana plantations. The American flag had been planted and men had died so that American corporations could extract wealth from poor countries. This realization broke something in Butler, but it also freed him. He began to speak out with a moral courage that was rare then and is rare now. He traveled the country giving speeches that shocked and horrified the establishment. He told audiences that war was a racket conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. He said that he had been nothing more than a high-class muscle man for big business, a gangster for capitalism. He said he had been Al Capone with a better tailor. The bankers on Wall Street knew who Smedley Butler was. They knew his reputation. They knew he was a hero to the veterans, that if Smedley Butler told the soldiers to march, the soldiers would march. They knew he had commanded men in battle and that those men would follow him to hell and back. But they didn't listen to what he was actually saying. They didn't hear the content of his speeches. They only saw the surface. They saw the medals. They saw the rank. They thought that because he was a general, he must be an authoritarian at heart. They thought that because he was a military man, he would naturally hate democracy and love order. They looked at his uniform and completely missed the man inside it. They assumed he thought like them, that order and profit were more important than freedom. That arrogance, that fundamental misunderstanding of who Smedley Butler really was, would be their complete undoing. The plot began quietly, as all the most dangerous plots do. It didn't start with a bang or a dramatic confrontation. It started with a knock on the door. It was July of 1933. Smedley Butler was retired, living in quiet obscurity in his modest farmhouse in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. He was 52 years old. His fighting days were behind him. He spent his days writing, tending to his garden, taking long walks in the woods, trying to wash the mud of the trenches and the blood of the battlefields off his soul. He was trying to find peace. A heavy black limousine, the kind that screamed money and power, pulled up the long gravel driveway to his farmhouse. It was an incongruous sight in that rural setting. Two men got out. One was named Bill Doyle, a man Butler knew slightly from veterans circles. The other was a man Butler had never met before. He was heavy-set, with a round, sweating face and a slippery smile that never quite reached his eyes. His name was Gerald MacGuire. Gerald MacGuire was a bond salesman, which in 1933 was a profession that required a certain moral flexibility. But he wasn't just any bond salesman hustling for commissions. He worked for a company called Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, which was one of the most prestigious brokerage firms on Wall Street. Colonel Grayson Murphy, the head of the firm, was an extraordinarily powerful man with connections throughout the highest levels of American business and finance. He sat on the boards of major corporations like Goodyear and Bethlehem Steel. He was a director at the Guarantee Trust Company, which was a bank controlled by the mighty JP Morgan empire. MacGuire was a smooth talker, the kind of man who had made a career out of convincing people to do things that were not in their best interest. He could sell ice to a polar bear in the Arctic. He walked into Butler's home with the easy confidence of a man who believed he could talk his way into or out of anything. He sat down in Butler's study, made himself comfortable, accepted the offered drink, and started talking about the veterans. At the time, the veterans of World War I, men who had fought in the trenches, who had been gassed and shot and traumatized, were suffering terribly in the Depression. The government had promised them a bonus payment for their service, a compensation for the years they had given to the country and the horrors they had endured. But the bonus had been delayed until 1945, more than a decade away. The veterans needed that money now. They were starving. Their families were homeless. They felt utterly betrayed by the country they had bled for. MacGuire told Butler, in his oily, persuasive voice, that he represented a group of wealthy, concerned citizens who wanted to help the veterans, patriotic men who understood the sacrifice the soldiers had made. He said they wanted to invite Butler to a convention of the American Legion in Chicago. They wanted him to give a speech, to use his influence and his fame. They wanted him to demand that the government pay the soldiers in gold, not worthless paper money. Butler's instincts, which had been honed by decades of combat and had kept him alive through countless battles, immediately started screaming warnings. He was suspicious. He knew the American Legion well. It was controlled by the establishment, by conservative forces who were generally hostile to veterans' demands for better treatment. It was not a radical organization. Why would they want a firebrand like him, a man who gave speeches attacking Wall Street, to speak at their convention? And why did they specifically care about gold? What did gold have to do with helping starving veterans? MacGuire, sensing Butler's hesitation, opened his briefcase with a theatrical flourish. Inside was a stack of cash, $18,000 in crisp bills. In 1933, in the depths of the Depression, when working men were lucky to make a few dollars a week, $18,000 was an absolutely staggering fortune. It was enough to buy a house, to live comfortably for years. MacGuire pushed the money across the table. He said it was for expenses. He said they wanted Butler to take a team of boosters, paid supporters, to Chicago to help rig the convention, to pack the audience with friendly voices. Butler looked at the money. He looked at the sweating, nervous bond salesman sitting across from him. His combat instincts, which had never failed him, flared up like an alarm bell. This wasn't about veterans. Veterans didn't have $18,000 in cash lying around. This was about something else, something bigger, something dangerous. Butler made a decision. He would play along. He would be patient. He wanted to know who was behind this, what they really wanted, how deep this conspiracy went. He pushed the money back across the table, but he didn't say no. He said he needed time to think about it. He needed to consider the proposal carefully. Over the next several months, Gerald MacGuire became a frequent and increasingly familiar visitor to the farmhouse in Pennsylvania. He courted Butler like a lover, with patience and gifts and flattery. He took him to fancy dinners in Philadelphia's most expensive restaurants. He invited him to stay in luxury hotels. He bought him drinks. He told him how important he was, how much the country needed him. And slowly, piece by careful piece, like a puzzle being assembled, he began to reveal the true horrifying nature of his mission. The gold issue was the key to understanding everything. MacGuire explained, with growing passion and decreasing caution, that the men he worked for were absolutely furious that President Roosevelt had taken the United States off the gold standard. These men held millions of dollars in bonds, financial instruments whose value was tied to gold. When Roosevelt devalued the dollar to help farmers and workers pay their debts, those bonds lost half their value overnight. The wealthy bondholders felt they had been robbed by their own government. They wanted Butler to use his influence with the soldiers, to mobilize the veterans as a political force to terrorize the government into going back to gold to restore their lost wealth. But it went deeper than money. It always does. It was about power. It was about control. It was about who really runs America. During one meeting in a hotel suite in Newark, MacGuire dropped his mask entirely. The smooth salesman disappeared, and Butler saw the true believer underneath. MacGuire started talking about the state of the country with barely controlled panic. He said that democracy was failing, that the masses were too stupid to govern themselves. He said that Roosevelt was destroying the very fabric of American society with his radical experiments. He said that what America needed was a change, a fundamental change in how the country was governed. Then MacGuire said something that made Butler's blood run cold. He told Butler that he had been sent to Europe. His bosses, these mysterious wealthy men, had paid for him to travel first class to Italy and Germany and France. They had sent him on a research mission. But he wasn't studying art or architecture or history. He was studying fascism. He was studying paramilitary organizations. He was studying how to overthrow democracy. MacGuire spoke with glowing, almost sexual admiration about a group called the Croix de Feu in France, the Cross of Fire. It was an organization of right-wing military veterans who operated as a private army for conservative interests. They had marched on the French Parliament in a show of force. They were disciplined, ideologically committed, and willing to use violence. MacGuire was clearly fascinated by them. He said that America needed its own Croix de Feu. He said that the police couldn't handle the growing social unrest, the strikes, the protests. He said the National Guard was unreliable because the soldiers might sympathize with the protesters. He said the country needed what he called a super organization of veterans, a private army that would be loyal not to the president, not to the Constitution, but to the leaders of business, an army that would protect property and profits, and they needed a leader for this army. They needed a man on a white horse, a figure the troops would follow. They needed Smedley Butler. Butler sat there in that hotel room, listening to this bond salesman, this nobody, this lackey, outline treason against the United States of America. His face remained like stone betraying nothing. Inside, rage was building, but he kept asking questions. Who is paying for this? How many men do you think you can recruit? What exactly is the plan? MacGuire, interpreting Butler's questions as interest rather than intelligence gathering, got excited. He sensed that the general was coming around. He started naming names, real names of real people. He said that the money was there, that they had already raised $3 million in a working fund and had commitments for $30 million more if the operation moved forward. $30 million in 1933 was an almost incomprehensible fortune. He mentioned the family of Isaac Singer, the sewing machine magnate. He mentioned the Rockefeller interests. But the biggest name he dropped, the one that made Butler realize just how serious this was the JP Morgan powerhouse, the most powerful bank in America, perhaps in the world. MacGuire told Butler that a new organization had been formed called the American Liberty League. On paper, it was just another political advocacy group, a collection of concerned citizens dedicated to defending the Constitution from Roosevelt's overreach. But MacGuire said it was just a front, a respectable facade. The American Liberty League was the financial engine that would power the coup. The American Liberty League was absolutely real. It had been formed in August of 1934 by a collection of the wealthiest men in America, men who were united in their hatred of the New Deal. Its members included the leaders of General Motors, General Foods, and the DuPont chemical empire. These were men who quite literally owned the steel, the oil, and the railroads of America. They were the kings of the industrial age, and they felt their kingdom was being threatened by what they saw as a cripple in a wheelchair in the White House, a traitor to his class who was destroying everything they had built. MacGuire laid out the plan in chilling, methodical detail, like a general briefing his troops before battle. They would recruit 500,000 men, 500,000 soldiers. They would use the American Legion as the recruiting base, reaching out to veterans who were angry, desperate, and unemployed. Then they would break away to form this new paramilitary organization. They would arm them with rifles and ammunition. The weapons would come from the Remington Arms Company, which was controlled by the DuPont family. It was all in the family, MacGuire said, with a wink. Everything was connected. This army of 500,000 men would march on Washington, D.C. in a massive show of force. It would not be a violent invasion with shooting in the streets, at least not at first. It would be a demonstration of overwhelming will and power, a message that could not be ignored. They would surround the White House, they would fill the streets of the Capitol, and they would demand an audience with President Roosevelt. Butler asked, his voice carefully neutral, what exactly they would say to the president. MacGuire smiled, and in that smile Butler saw the face of fascism. MacGuire said they would be very polite, very respectful. They would tell the president that the job was too much for him, that his health was failing, that the burden of office was breaking him. They would suggest, in the kindest possible terms, that he needed help. They would propose the creation of a new cabinet position, a Secretary of General Affairs. This secretary would take over all the executive powers of the government. He would run the Army, the Navy, the economy, everything. Roosevelt would remain president in name only, a figurehead who would wave at parades and sign the papers that were put in front of him. But the real power would lie with the Secretary of General Affairs. The elected president would be a puppet, and the secretary would pull the strings. It was exactly the model that Mussolini had used in Italy. The King of Italy was still technically on the throne, but Il Duce ran the country. Democracy would continue to exist on paper, but it would be a hollow shell. MacGuire looked Butler in the eye and said the words that would echo through history. You are the man to be the secretary. You will be the dictator of the United States. Butler felt a cold rage building in his chest, threatening to explode. He looked at this soft, sweating man in his expensive suit, casually discussing the destruction of the American Republic like he was planning a business merger. Butler wanted desperately to reach across the table and snap his neck. It would have been so easy. One quick movement in this particular traitor would be silenced forever. But he knew, with the tactical mind of a general, that killing MacGuire wouldn't solve anything. MacGuire was just a messenger, a go-between. If he died, the plot would just find another general to recruit. They would find someone like Douglas MacArthur, who was known to have a massive ego and authoritarian tendencies. Or they would find someone else who would say yes. Butler realized that he had to be smart. He had to be patient. He had to become a spy in his own country, gathering evidence against his own class. He had to let the conspiracy unfold far enough that he could expose it completely, but not so far that it succeeded. He told MacGuire in a carefully measured voice that he was interested. The lie tasted like poison in his mouth, but he said he needed proof. He couldn't just take the word of a bond salesman. He needed to see the men at the top. He needed to see the money. He needed confirmation that this wasn't just the fantasy of one crazy salesman. MacGuire, delighted, agreed immediately. He arranged a meeting with one of the actual financiers behind the plot. His name was Robert Sterling Clark. Robert Sterling Clark was everything Gerald MacGuire aspired to be. He was an heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, born into wealth so vast that he had never had to work a day in his life. He was an art collector, a world traveler, a snob who moved in the highest circles of society. He was a millionaire many times over, the kind of man who thought of money the way normal people think of air, infinite and always available. The meeting took place in the opulent lobby of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, one of the grandest hotels in America. The lobby dripped with wealth. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gilded fixtures. It was a temple to money, and Clark was one of its high priests. Clark didn't believe in subtlety or patience. He was arrogant, entitled, and he got straight to the point. He told Butler in a voice that expected obedience that he was willing to spend half his fortune to save the other half. He said that the gold standard was the only thing that mattered, the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. He said that if Roosevelt kept messing with the currency, the entire country would descend into ruin and revolution. He confirmed everything MacGuire had said. He confirmed that the money was available, that the weapons could be procured, that they were looking for a strong man to lead the veterans. He even tried to bribe Butler right there in the lobby of the hotel, in front of the other guests, sipping their tea and reading their newspapers. He pulled out his checkbook, an actual checkbook, and offered to write a check for tens of thousands of dollars to Butler's family. He said it like he was offering to buy a car, casual and matter of fact. Butler refused the check, but he had what he needed. He had a second witness to the conspiracy. He had confirmation that this wasn't just MacGuire's fantasy, because Butler had been smart. He had brought along a reporter named Paul Comley French. French wrote for the Philadelphia Record and the New York Post. Butler had introduced him as his personal secretary, just another anonymous assistant taking notes. Clark and MacGuire, in their arrogance, had assumed he was just a lackey and had spoken freely in front of him, never imagining that every word was being recorded for posterity. French took meticulous notes. He wrote down the names. He wrote down the amounts of money being discussed. He wrote down the most chilling quote from MacGuire, the one that revealed the true nature of what they were planning. MacGuire had said, without shame or hesitation, "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down." There it was, the mask completely off. Fascism in America, funded by American millionaires. Armed with this evidence, with witnesses and documentation, Butler was ready to strike. But he wasn't going to use a gun or a bomb. He was going to use the most powerful weapon available in a democracy, the truth. But who could he tell? That was the deadly question. The police were controlled by the politicians, many of whom were in the pockets of these same wealthy men. The politicians were owned by the bankers. Their campaigns were funded by the very men Butler was trying to expose. The newspapers were owned by the industrialists. It was a closed system, a web of corruption and mutual interest. Butler knew he was walking into a trap. If he went public the wrong way, if he just held a press conference and started making accusations, they would destroy him. They would call him crazy, a paranoid old soldier suffering from shell shock. They would say he was making up stories for attention. They would destroy his reputation, the one thing he had left, and without credibility, the truth would die with him. He needed a forum where he would be taken seriously. He needed to be under oath, where lying would be a crime. He needed official documentation that couldn't be dismissed or buried. In November of 1934, he contacted the House Un-American Activities Committee. At that time, the committee was known as the McCormack-Dickstein Committee, named after its co-chairman John McCormack of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York. It had been formed to investigate Nazi propaganda in the United States, to root out foreign agents spreading fascist ideology. Butler told them, in careful but urgent terms, that he had a story that would blow the lid off Washington. He told them that the real threat to American democracy wasn't coming from Berlin or Moscow. It was coming from Wall Street, from men in three-piece suits in Manhattan boardrooms. The committee agreed to hear him, but they were nervous, terrified, really. They knew that if they went after Morgan and DuPont and the other giants of industry, they were poking a dragon that could destroy them. These were the most powerful men in America. They could end political careers with a phone call. They could destroy newspapers. They could ruin lives. So the committee made a decision that would haunt American history. They decided to hold the hearings in secret. It would be an executive session, closed to the public. No press, no cameras, no public record that could be immediately distributed. Just the general and the congressman and the stenographer, hidden away in a room where the truth could be spoken but controlled. On November 20th, 1934, Smedley Butler walked into the committee room in the Bar Association building in New York City. He was wearing his best suit, freshly pressed. He looked tired. The weight of what he was carrying had aged him. But his eyes, those famous gimlet eyes that had stared down death in a dozen battles, were sharp and focused. He sat down at the wooden table. He placed his weathered right hand on the Bible. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help him God. And then he began to speak. Butler talked for 2 hours straight. His voice was clear and steady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. He named Gerald MacGuire. He named Robert Sterling Clark. He named the American Liberty League and its wealthy backers. He detailed the bribe attempts, the $18,000 in cash, the check that Clark had offered to write. He detailed the plan for the army of 500,000 veterans. He detailed the plot to turn President Franklin Delano Roosevelt into a puppet, a powerless figurehead, while unelected businessmen ran the country. The congressman sat in stunned silence as Butler spoke. It sounded like the plot of a pulp fiction novel, like something too outrageous to be true. A conspiracy theory come to life. And yet the man telling the story was the most decorated hero in the land, a man whose integrity was beyond question, who had no reason to lie, who had everything to lose by coming forward. When Butler finished, he looked directly at McCormack and Dickstein. He challenged them. He said, his voice hard, "You have the power to stop this. You have the power to save this democracy. But you have to be brave enough to call these men to the stand. You have to be willing to fight." The committee thanked him formally and said they would investigate. But as Butler walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the corridor, he knew in his gut that the real battle was just beginning. The secret testimony wouldn't stay secret for long, secrets that explosive never do. And once the story broke, the full weight of the American establishment, with all its money and influence and power, would come crashing down on his head like an avalanche. He went home to his farm in Pennsylvania and waited for the storm he knew was coming. The next morning, the story leaked to the press like water bursting through a cracked dam. Someone on the committee, no one ever discovered who, had talked to a reporter. Within hours, the headlines screamed across the nation in thick black letters. General Butler alleges fascist plot. Plot to seize Washington exposed. Marine hero claims Wall Street conspiracy. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely brutal. This was not the age of the internet where people could debate the facts in real time, where citizen journalists could investigate, where information could spread democratically. This was the age of the radio and the newspaper. And the men who owned the newspapers, who controlled the radio stations, were the friends and business partners of the very men Butler had accused. The media was not independent, it was owned. And it responded accordingly. The New York Times, the newspaper of record, the publication that Americans trusted to tell them the truth, ran a headline that didn't just report the story, it mocked it. They called it a gigantic hoax, treating it as a joke from the first word. Their editorial board, composed of men who socialized with the Morgan partners and the DuPont executives, wrote scathing pieces questioning Butler's sanity. They called his testimony a fantasy concocted by a man who missed the spotlight, suggesting that the old general was making up stories because he couldn't handle retirement because he was desperate for attention. Time magazine, then, as now a publication that shaped how Americans understood their world, was even crueler. In an article dripping with contempt, they called the whole affair the plot of the cream puffs, mocking the idea that wealthy, respectable bankers, men who played golf at country clubs and donated to charities, could be involved in treason. They painted Butler as a naive simpleton, a man whose brain had been damaged by too many years in combat, who had misunderstood an innocent conversation about politics. They ridiculed everything about him, his language, his background, his service. They made him a punchline. The accused men, the millionaires and bankers whose names Butler had spoken under oath, issued furious denials through their lawyers and publicists. Thomas Lamont, a powerful partner at JP Morgan, told the press with barely concealed amusement, "It is too ridiculous to comment on." He laughed it off as if someone had accused him of believing in fairies. The idea that JP Morgan, the bank that had financed World War I, that had rebuilt Europe, that represented old money and old power, would be involved in something so crude as a military coup was to him absurd on its face. Grayson Murphy, McGuire's boss, called it an absolute lie and threatened to sue anyone who repeated the accusations. Robert Sterling Clark, the heir who had offered the bribe in the hotel lobby, didn't even dignify the charges with a response. He simply vanished, fled to Europe to wait out the scandal in comfort, spending his fortune on art while the controversy swirled in America. Gerald MacGuire, the bond salesman who had recruited Butler, was the only one who couldn't hide or run. He was hauled before the committee like a criminal being dragged to justice, but even he played the game beautifully. He denied everything with the skill of a professional liar. He said he was just a businessman trying to make a living. He said he knew General Butler. They'd had some conversations, sure, but they had never discussed a coup or overthrowing the government. That was insane. He sweated profusely on the stand, his collar darkening with moisture, but he stuck to his story with the desperation of a man who knew his life depended on it. It looked like the cover-up was going to work perfectly. The media was systematically burying Smedley Butler, destroying his credibility with surgical precision. The public was confused, unsure who to believe. It was the word of one soldier, however decorated, against the word of the entire financial system, the newspapers, the establishment. And in that contest, the establishment always wins. But the committee, to their eternal credit, kept digging. They had Butler's testimony, which was compelling, but they needed more. They needed corroboration. They needed hard evidence that MacGuire wasn't just a figment of Butler's imagination, that this wasn't the paranoid fantasy the newspapers claimed it was. They issued subpoenas for MacGuire's travel records. They demanded to see the bank records of the American Liberty League and the companies associated with it. They interviewed dozens of witnesses. And slowly, piece by piece, the cracks began to appear in the wall of silence that the conspirators had built. They found the letters, actual physical letters written in MacGuire's own handwriting, letters he had sent from Europe to his bosses in New York while he was on his fact-finding mission. Letters where he praised Mussolini's efficiency and methods. Letters where he described in detail the fascist paramilitary organizations he had studied, clearly not as a critic, but as an admirer. Letters that proved MacGuire had been exactly where Butler said he had been, doing exactly what Butler said he had been doing. They found the bank transfers. Large sums of money, tens of thousands of dollars, moving from the accounts of wealthy industrialists into slush funds that MacGuire controlled. Money with no clear, legitimate purpose. Money that was being held for something. They brought in Paul Comley French, the reporter who had witnessed the hotel meeting. French was a credible journalist with a reputation for honesty. He corroborated everything Butler had said, word for word. He testified under oath that MacGuire had told him directly, "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists." The exact words. He had written them down at the time. The committee began to realize something that terrified them. Butler wasn't crazy. He wasn't lying. He wasn't senile. He was right. There had been a real plot. Wealthy Americans had seriously discussed overthrowing their own government. On February 15th, 1935, after months of investigation, the committee released its final report. It was a bombshell document that should have changed American history. The report stated, clearly and unambiguously, in the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that again. The United States Congress officially confirmed that there was a plot to overthrow the government. They confirmed that Smedley Butler had told the truth. They confirmed that wealthy Americans had committed treason. It was a complete vindication for Butler. He had been right. He had been telling the truth. He had saved American democracy. But then something strange and terrible happened. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There were no arrests. There were no trials. No one went to jail. Gerald MacGuire, who had lied under oath, who had committed perjury, wasn't charged with anything. JP Morgan wasn't hauled in for questioning. The DuPont family wasn't investigated. The wealthy backers of the American Liberty League were left completely alone. The final report was released, but in many published versions, the names of the wealthy backers were redacted, blacked out, hidden from the American people. The investigation was quietly closed. The file was sealed. The story disappeared from the newspapers as quickly as it had appeared. Within weeks, it was as if it had never happened. Why? Why did the government let them get away with it? Why were traitors allowed to walk free? The answer lies in the harsh, cynical reality of politics and power. Franklin Roosevelt was many things, but he was above all a pragmatist, a political chess player who thought several moves ahead. He knew that the plot had been real. His intelligence services had briefed him. He knew the names. He knew who was involved. But he also knew that the country was still drowning in the Depression. The economy was still fragile. Banks needed to lend money to businesses. Factories needed to employ workers. The New Deal programs needed cooperation from industry to succeed. If Roosevelt threw the captains of industry in prison, the economic recovery could collapse. The banks might close. The factories might shut down. The fragile green shoots of recovery might wither and die. And Roosevelt, with his eyes on the horizon, could see something else. Looking across the Atlantic Ocean, he saw the storm clouds of a real war gathering over Europe. Hitler was rearming Germany in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Mussolini was invading Ethiopia. The Spanish Civil War was brewing. Roosevelt, who understood history, knew that sooner or later the United States would have to fight fascism abroad. And to do that, America would need weapons. Lots of weapons. Tanks, planes, ships, guns, ammunition. And who owned the steel mills? The DuPonts. Who owned the chemical plants that could make explosives? The DuPonts. Who owned the factories that could be converted to war production? The very men who had tried to overthrow him. Roosevelt couldn't afford to throw the captains of industry in prison when he needed them to build the arsenal of democracy. It was a brutal calculation, a moral compromise. Justice for treason versus the survival of the nation in the coming war. He chose survival. So a deal was likely struck, never written down, never spoken aloud, but understood by all parties. A quiet understanding between Roosevelt and the Wall Street elite. The plot would be buried. The conspirators would stay out of prison. But in exchange, they would back off. The American Liberty League would lose its teeth and its funding. Wall Street would stop trying to destroy the New Deal. They would cooperate with the government, at least enough to keep the economy moving. It was realpolitik at its most cynical. The traitors went free because the country needed their factories. Smedley Butler saved the country from fascism, from the overthrow of democracy. But he paid the price that truth-tellers always pay. He was labeled a crank, a nuisance, a conspiracy theorist. His reputation was permanently damaged. The establishment never forgave him for breaking the code of silence, for exposing what was supposed to remain hidden. He spent the rest of his life touring the country like a prophet in the wilderness, trying to warn people about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, about how war was being used as a tool of corporate profit, about how democracy was being undermined from within. But fewer and fewer people listened. The newspapers stopped covering his speeches. The crowds grew smaller. The man who had been the most decorated Marine in American history became a footnote, an embarrassment. He died in 1940 at the age of 58, just months before the United States entered World War II, the war he had warned was coming. He died in the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia, the same city where the plot against America had been hatched. He died knowing that the men who had tried to overthrow his country were still free, still wealthy, still powerful. His funeral was simple and quiet. There was no state funeral, no massive ceremony. The president did not attend. The generals who should have honored him stayed away. He was buried with military honors in a small cemetery, and then he was forgotten by the nation he had saved. Today, the business plot is treated by mainstream historians as a footnote, a strange curiosity, an odd little conspiracy that didn't amount to much. Most American textbooks don't mention it. Most Americans have never heard of it. When it is discussed, it's often dismissed or minimized, but it serves as a terrifying reminder of truths we desperately need to remember. It reminds us that democracy is fragile, far more fragile than we want to believe. It can be destroyed not just by foreign armies, but by the wealthy, and powerful within our own borders, who view freedom not as a sacred right, but as an obstacle to their profit and power. It reminds us that there are always people, in every generation, who believe that they are above the law, that their wealth entitles them to special treatment, that the rules that govern ordinary people don't apply to them. It reminds us that the greatest threat to a nation often comes not from the obvious enemy with guns and tanks, but from the men in expensive suits in boardrooms making decisions in secret, believing that they know better than the people how the country should be run. Smedley Butler was a warrior who learned the hardest lesson of all, that the hardest battle is not fighting the enemy in front of you, but fighting the corruption behind you within your own country, your own class, your own system. He was the man who was offered absolute power, who could have been the dictator of the United States, and refused. He refused not because it wouldn't have worked, not because he couldn't have done it, but because he believed in the Constitution. He believed in democracy. He believed that power belongs to the people, not to generals or bankers. His warning echoes through the decades to us today, more relevant than ever. War is a racket. Democracy is fragile. And liberty is never safe as long as there are men with money who believe they can buy the law. The story doesn't end with Butler's death. The forces he fought against didn't disappear. They evolved. The plotters of 1933 wanted to install a Secretary of General Affairs to manage the country for the benefit of business. Look around at America today. The lobbying industry in Washington is a multi-billion-dollar machine that dwarfs anything that existed in Butler's time. The revolving door between the Pentagon and the defense contractors spins faster than ever, with generals retiring to become executives at the companies they once bought weapons from. Corporations don't just influence legislation, they often draft it themselves, handing it to compliant congressmen to introduce. In a very real way, the business plot didn't fail. It just evolved. It went from a crude plan for a violent takeover to a sophisticated program of corporate capture of government. Why stage a coup when you can simply buy the politicians? Why march on Washington when you can hire the lobbyists? Why overthrow democracy when you can hollow it out from within? The men in the smoke-filled rooms in 1933 wanted to seize power through force. Their successors realized that it was far more effective to purchase it through campaign contributions, through lobbying, through the slow capture of regulatory agencies, through the funding of think tanks that shape policy. Smedley Butler is a ghost that haunts modern America. He stands as the ultimate example of integrity in a world that constantly tries to buy it. He was a man who was offered everything: power, money, absolute control over a nation, and turned it down because he believed in something larger than himself. He reminds us that the uniform does not make the patriot. The bank account does not make the citizen. The medals do not make the hero. Character makes the hero. Integrity makes the patriot. The willingness to sacrifice everything for principle makes the citizen. The story of the business plot is, in the end, a tragedy because justice was not fully served. The traitors walked free. The crime was covered up. The truth was buried. But it is also a triumph. It is a triumph of one man's conscience against the weight of the world, against the combined power of the wealthiest men in America. It is proof that courage matters, that one person telling the truth can change history. When you look at a photograph of Smedley Butler today, you don't see the medals on his chest first. You see the eyes, those famous gimlet eyes, hard and unflinching. They are looking at us across the decades. They are asking us a question that every generation must answer. They are asking, what would you do if they knocked on your door with a suitcase full of cash and a plan to steal the country? Would you take the money? Would you rationalize it? Tell yourself that you could do good with power? Or would you do what Smedley Butler did? Would you tell the truth, knowing it would cost you everything? The Republic survived 1933 because one man, when offered the chance to be a king, chose to remain a citizen. We can only hope that when the knock comes again, and it will come again in some form in every generation, there will be someone there to answer it with the same courage, the same integrity, the same fundamental decency. The business plot was the moment when the mask slipped and we saw the true face of power in America. For a brief, terrifying second, we saw what the wealthy and powerful really thought about democracy, about the Constitution, about the American people, and then, just as quickly, the mask was put back on. The story was buried. The conspirators went free. Business continued as usual. But thanks to Smedley Butler, we know what happened. We know what lies beneath the surface. We know that it can happen here. We know that democracy is not guaranteed, that freedom is not permanent, that every generation must fight to preserve it, and we can never say we weren't warned. The old Marine general, standing in his farmhouse in Pennsylvania, looking at the bribe money on the table, made a choice. He chose truth over power. He chose the country over wealth. He chose democracy over dictatorship. That choice saved America. We honor his memory not with monuments or holidays, but by remembering his warning and staying vigilant. The price of liberty, as the saying goes, is eternal vigilance. Smedley Butler paid that price. The question is, will we? This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.